Today we are beginning the story of a woman who was a master of reinvention. Her name was Lady Sylvia Ashley, and they say a swan marries a lake, finding its perfect reflection in the water. Sylvia, it seems, was a swan never content with just one lake. She sought out the grandest and most turbulent bodies of water in the world, from the ancient pools of the British aristocracy to the sun-drenched ocean of Hollywood, and finally, to the quiet waters of European royalty. Her life was a whirlwind of passion, scandal, and heartbreak, a life so dazzlingly complex that even the great chronicler of high society, Truman Capote, found her too much. So this isn't just a story about a beautiful woman who married well. This is the story of how a girl named Edith Sylvia Hawkes, born into the humble working-class streets of London, built herself into an icon. It's a story about ambition, survival, and the relentless quest to create a life that was in itself a magnificent work of art. And it begins not in a palace, but in the gritty, gaslit heart of turn-of-the-century London. To understand the extraordinary creature that Sylvia would become, we first have to understand the world that forged her. She was born Edith Sylvia Hawkes on the 1st of April, 1904. This was Edwardian England, a society perched on the knife edge between the rigid, corseted morality of the Victorian era and the explosive revolutionary chaos that was just around the corner. It was a world of breathtaking confidence, the height of the British Empire, where London was the undisputed capital of the world. But beneath this grand, self-assured facade, it was a society riddled with anxiety and governed by a class system as rigid and as unforgiving as granite. Your birth determined everything. It dictated where you lived, how you spoke, whom you could marry, and what you could aspire to. The aristocracy, with their ancient titles and vast country estates, sat at the very pinnacle. Below them were the burgeoning upper middle classes, professionals and industrialists. And far below that, in the sprawling, often grimy and endlessly striving heart of the city, was the working class. For a girl born into this world, the path was largely set. You were expected to marry within your station, to become a wife and a mother, your life a quiet and respectable echo of your parents. Social mobility was a beautiful dream, but for most it was just that, a dream. Sylvia Hawkes was born not into a Mayfair mansion, but in Paddington, a respectable but decidedly unglamorous part of London. And here we encounter the very first act of her lifelong reinvention. For years, society columns and biographies would state that her father, Arthur Hawkes, was a respected colonel. It was a good story, one that added a touch of military gentility to her background. The truth, however, was far more humble and in its own way far more interesting. Arthur Hawkes was not a colonel. He was a hotel and livery stable keeper. He managed the transport for a hotel, a world of horses, carriages, and serving the needs of the wealthy, but not being one of them. This detail is not a criticism. It's the key that unlocks Sylvia's entire character. From her earliest days, she was a keen observer, watching the wealthy guests come and go. She saw their fine clothes, their confident bearing, their easy assumption of privilege. She was on the outside looking in, and it was from this vantage point that a fierce and unshakable ambition began to bloom. She possessed two assets that could, if used correctly, blast through the rigid walls of the British class system: a face of almost startling, ethereal beauty, and a will of pure, unyielding steel. As Sylvia grew into a teenager, the world around her was torn apart and then remade. The Great War of 1914 to 1918 was a cataclysm that shattered the old certainties. It decimated a generation of young men, but it also, paradoxically, created new opportunities, particularly for women. They had worked in factories, driven ambulances, and kept the country running. The post-war world was a different place. There was a desperate, almost manic thirst for life, for fun, for glamour. The roaring 20s had arrived, and with them came jazz, cocktails, shorter skirts, and a new kind of woman, the flapper. This was the world Sylvia was perfectly poised to conquer. She was young, beautiful, and utterly unwilling to return to the quiet, predetermined life of a stable keeper's daughter. London's West End, with its dazzling theaters and nightclubs, was calling, and Sylvia was more than ready to answer. She was about to take her first decisive step onto the stage, both literally and metaphorically. In the London of the early 1920s, the beating heart of glamour and popular entertainment was the theater, and the undisputed king of the London stage was a brilliant, flamboyant impresario named Charles B. Cochrane. He was the British equivalent of Florence Ziegfeld in America, a showman who produced lavish, sophisticated revues that were the talk of the town. His shows were famous for their stunning sets, their witty songs, and above all, for their chorus lines of beautiful young women who became known as Cochrane's young ladies. To be one of Cochrane's young ladies was to be more than just a chorus girl. It was a stamp of approval, a mark of exceptional beauty, style, and charm. These were not the bawdy, slightly disreputable showgirls of the old music halls. Cochrane cultivated an image of elegance and refinement for his girls. They were presented as goddesses, draped in silks and feathers. Their job not just to dance, but to embody a kind of aspirational glamour. For a young woman from a modest background like Sylvia Hawkes, securing a place in Cochrane's chorus was like winning the lottery. It was her entry ticket into a world she had only ever dreamed of. And Sylvia, with her striking looks and natural poise, was a perfect fit. She joined the chorus, and it was here, in the glittering, competitive, and intoxicating world of the West End theater, that she truly began her education. It was an education in style, in how to carry herself, how to speak, and how to command attention without ever appearing to demand it. She learned the subtle art of conversation, the power of a well-timed smile, and the importance of impeccable grooming. The stage was her finishing school, but the most important part of this education took place after the curtain fell. Cochrane's revues were the place to be, and the audience was a glittering who's who of London society. Wealthy industrialists, young aristocrats, politicians, and visiting royalty all flocked to his shows. And they weren't just there to see the show, they were there to see and to meet the famous Cochrane's young ladies. The girls were frequently invited to glamorous after-show parties, their presence adding a touch of theatrical sparkle to the proceedings. This was a world of immense opportunity, but also of great peril. A chorus girl's reputation was a fragile thing. She was admired for her beauty, but she was also viewed with a certain suspicion by polite society. She was a working girl, after all, trading on her looks in a world where respectable women were not supposed to work at all. The path was a tightrope walk. One misstep, one scandal, and a girl could find her career and her reputation in tatters. Sylvia navigated this treacherous world with a skill that was nothing short of genius. She was popular and vivacious, but she maintained an air of elegant reserve. She was admired by men, but she was never seen as cheap or easy. She was playing a long game. She wasn't looking for a fleeting affair with a wealthy patron. She was looking for a permanent elevation. She was looking for a husband, and not just any husband. She was aiming for the very top. In this glittering pond filled with admirers, she was waiting for the biggest fish of all. She didn't have to wait long. One night, in the audience, was a man who could offer her everything she had ever dreamed of: a title, a fortune, and a name that was stitched into the very fabric of the British aristocracy. His name was Lord Anthony Ashley Cooper. Lord Anthony Ashley Cooper, known to his friends as Tony, was, on paper, one of the most eligible bachelors in England. He was the heir to one of the country's oldest and most respected titles, the Earl of Shaftesbury. The Ashley Cooper family could trace their lineage back for centuries. They were not the flashy new money of the industrial age. They were the old guard, the landed gentry, a family whose name was synonymous with tradition, duty, and immense, long-held privilege. Their family seat, St. Giles House in Dorset, was a magnificent ancestral home, a testament to generations of power and influence. Tony Ashley himself was the epitome of the young English aristocrat of his time. Educated at Eton and Oxford, he was charming, handsome, and slightly aimless, as many young men of his class were. His life was a comfortable whirlwind of country weekends, horse racing at Ascot, shooting parties, and glamorous nights out in London. He was, in essence, a prince of the establishment. And then he met Sylvia Hawkes, the beautiful young showgirl. For Tony, Sylvia must have been like a breath of fresh, exhilarating air. She was everything the debutantes of his own class were not. They were often shy, sheltered, and bound by 1,000 unspoken rules of etiquette. Sylvia was confident, witty, and worldly. She had a life of her own, a career, a sparkle that was entirely her own creation. He was utterly captivated, completely bewitched by her. Their courtship was a whirlwind, the talk of the society columns. The dashing young lord and the beautiful chorus girl. It was a story straight out of a fairy tale or a cautionary tale, depending on your point of view. For Sylvia, Tony was the ultimate prize. Marrying him wasn't just about love. It was about arrival. It was the culmination of everything she had been working towards. It was a leap across the unbridgeable chasm of the British class system. In February 1927, they were married. Edith Sylvia Hawkes, the stable keeper's daughter from Paddington, became Lady Sylvia Ashley, the future Countess of Shaftesbury. She was just 22 years old. The wedding was a major society event, but it was also a source of considerable scandal and disapproval. The old guard of the aristocracy was aghast. The idea of the heir to the Shaftesbury earldom marrying a chorus girl was, to them, a shocking betrayal of his class and his duty. The press had a field day, with some outlets celebrating the romantic fairy tale and others tut-tutting about the decline of traditional values. Sylvia was now under a microscope, her every move scrutinized. Many were waiting, even hoping for her to fail, to prove that she didn't belong. But Sylvia once again proved them wrong. She stepped into her new role as Lady Ashley with an effortless grace that stunned her detractors. She was a natural hostess, her parties becoming legendary for their mix of high society, theatrical flair, and genuine fun. She managed their grand London house and their country estate with an efficiency that impressed even her most skeptical in-laws. She quickly mastered the complex etiquette of her new world, proving that she was more than just a pretty face. She was, in every sense, playing the part of a lifetime, and she was playing it to perfection. However, the fairy tale soon began to show its cracks. The very things that had drawn the couple together, their vastly different backgrounds, also began to drive them apart. Tony, for all his charm, was a man of his class. He was a creature of tradition, happiest in the familiar rhythms of country life. He loved shooting, farming, and managing the family estate. Sylvia, on the other hand, was a creature of excitement and glamour. She thrived on the energy of the city, on parties, on travel, on being at the very center of the social whirl. She was ambitious and restless, always looking for the next thrill, the next adventure. There's a revealing anecdote from this period, recounted by a friend of the couple. They were hosting a weekend party at the family's country estate. Tony spent the day happily discussing crop rotations with his estate manager, while Sylvia was desperately trying to liven things up, organizing a treasure hunt, and teaching their aristocratic guests the latest dance crazes from London. The friend noted the visible disconnect. Tony seemed perfectly content, the friend recalled, while Sylvia looked like a beautiful caged panther, pacing and longing for the bright lights. She found the staid, formal world of the British aristocracy to be, in a word, boring. The endless, repetitive cycle of country pursuits and the stilted, formal conversations held little appeal for her. The initial thrill of her new status began to wear off, replaced by a sense of confinement. She was Lady Ashley, mistress of a great house, but she was also trapped in a life that wasn't truly her own. The man she had married was kind and devoted, but he could not provide the excitement and the grand international stage that her ambition craved. The ancient, calm lake of the British aristocracy had provided her with a title and security, but its waters were proving to be too shallow, too still. Sylvia's gaze began to drift westward, across the Atlantic, to a place where a new kind of royalty reigned, a place of sun, celluloid, and unimaginable glamour. Hollywood. The marriage that had been her greatest triumph was beginning to feel like a beautiful gilded cage, and Sylvia Hawkes was never one to stay caged for long. The stage was being set for her next and most spectacular reinvention. The formal separation from Lord Ashley in the early 1930s was handled with discreet, civilized veneer, but for Sylvia, it was an act of profound courage. Instead of retreating, she doubled down on her social life, becoming a key figure in the fast-living circle of London's bright young things. But London, she was beginning to realize, was too small a stage. The world was changing, and the center of gravity for glamour was shifting across the ocean. Sylvia could feel the pull of the siren song of Hollywood. The formal separation from Lord Ashley, when it came in the early 1930s, was handled with the discreet, civilized veneer that the British upper classes do so well. There were no public screaming matches, no messy tabloid exposés. It was a quiet, mutual agreement that their worlds were simply incompatible. But beneath the surface, it was a seismic shift. For Sylvia, it was an act of profound courage to willingly give up the security of her position, to step away from the title she had so coveted, was a massive gamble. She was now in a precarious social position, a separated woman, still technically Lady Ashley, but without a husband by her side. In the eyes of many, she was damaged goods. But Sylvia was a survivor. She did not retreat into the shadows. Instead, she doubled down on her social life, creating a world for herself in London that was even more glamorous than the one she'd had with her husband. She became a key figure in the fast-living, witty, and slightly decadent circle of the bright young things. Her friends now included the likes of the brilliant playwright and wit Noel Coward, the celebrated photographer Cecil Beaton, and even members of the royal family's inner circle, including the dashing and controversial Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VIII. She was a regular at the most exclusive parties, her presence a guarantee of sparkle and style. She was a woman who knew everyone and was desired by many. Accounts from this period describe her as being more dazzling than ever, her beauty sharpened by a newfound independence and a hint of worldly sadness. She was no longer just Lord Ashley's wife. She was her own woman, a society star in her own right. But London, she was beginning to realize, was too small a stage. The world was changing, and the center of gravity for glamour, power, and fame was shifting decisively across the ocean. Sylvia could feel the pull of a new, irresistible current. It was the siren song of Hollywood. In the 1930s, Hollywood wasn't just a place, it was an idea. It was the global capital of dreams, a shimmering, sun-drenched fantasy factory that projected its vision of life, love, and adventure onto screens all around the world. In an era of global depression and rising political tension, Hollywood offered an escape. It was a modern-day Olympus populated by a new breed of gods and goddesses whose faces were more famous than those of kings and presidents. For someone like Sylvia, Hollywood represented the ultimate meritocracy of glamour. Here it didn't matter who your father was or what school you went to. All that mattered was your star power, your charisma, your ability to captivate an audience, both on screen and off. The rigid class barriers of England simply didn't exist. It was a new kind of aristocracy, one built not on lineage but on personality. It was a world tailor-made for her. Sylvia began to make trips to America, initially to New York, and then inevitably to Los Angeles. With her title, her beauty, and her London sophistication, she was an instant sensation. She was exotic, elegant, and had an air of aristocratic grace that the new money of Hollywood found utterly intoxicating. She was quickly embraced by the Hollywood elite, invited to the most exclusive parties and the most powerful dinner tables. And it was at one of these gatherings that she met the man who was not just a star, but the undisputed king of Hollywood himself, Douglas Fairbanks. To understand the magnitude of this meeting, you have to understand who Douglas Fairbanks was. He wasn't just an actor, he was an icon, a phenomenon. In the silent era, he had been the definitive action hero, the swashbuckling star of films like The Mark of Zorro, Robin Hood, and The Thief of Baghdad. With his athletic grace, his dazzling smile, and his infectious, optimistic energy, he embodied a kind of all-American ideal. He was more than a movie star. He was a global celebrity, a founding member of United Artists Studio, alongside Charlie Chaplin, and a man of immense wealth and influence. But his fame was only one half of the equation. For nearly 2 decades, he had been one half of the most famous couple on the planet. His marriage to actress Mary Pickford, America's sweetheart, was the stuff of legend. Together, they were Hollywood's first super couple, its reigning king and queen. Their magnificent Beverly Hills estate, a sprawling mansion they named Pickfair, was the unofficial heart of Hollywood society. To receive an invitation to Pickfair was the ultimate social validation. They hosted royalty, heads of state, and cultural icons like Albert Einstein and H.G. Wells. Their love story was seen as a perfect real-life fairy tale, a symbol of everything that was magical about Hollywood. But by the time Sylvia met him in the mid-1930s, the fairy tale was over. The king was in exile from his own kingdom. His marriage to Mary Pickford had been crumbling for years, a slow, painful process hidden behind the high walls of Pickfair. Fairbanks, now in his early 50s, was terrified of aging. He desperately clung to his youth, engaging in punishing exercise routines and embarking on long, restless trips around the world. Mary, on the other hand, had become more of a recluse, weary of the constant performance of being a star and battling a growing dependence on alcohol. Their worlds had drifted apart, and the love that had once captivated the world had curdled into resentment and sadness. Fairbanks had sought solace in the arms of other women, and his affair with Sylvia was the final, decisive blow. When news of their relationship broke, it wasn't just gossip. It was a global scandal of epic proportions. The public divorce of Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford was a brutal, drawn-out, and intensely public affair. And Lady Sylvia Ashley was cast as the villain of the piece. Mary Pickford was more than just a movie star. She was a secular saint, a beloved icon who represented innocence and virtue. The public was fiercely, almost fanatically, protective of her. The idea that she had been betrayed by her swashbuckling husband for a sophisticated, title-hungry Englishwoman was an outrage. Sylvia was vilified in the press. She was portrayed as a predatory homewrecker, a cold, calculating aristocrat who had used her wiles to ensnare the aging king of Hollywood. She was everything Mary was not. Worldly where Mary was innocent, exotic where Mary was all-American, sophisticated where Mary was wholesome. It was a classic and cruel Madonna whore narrative, played out on an international stage. One particularly venomous columnist wrote, "Our little Mary, the girl with the golden curls who captured the world's heart, has been cast aside for a British lady whose only known talent is collecting husbands." The criticism was relentless and deeply personal. Sylvia, who had so carefully cultivated her image of elegance and grace, now found herself at the center of a very ugly, very public storm. But the controversy, in a strange way, only seemed to intensify the bond between her and Fairbanks. They were united against the world, two lovers caught in a tempest of their own making. Fairbanks, for his part, seemed liberated. The end of his marriage, however painful, was also the end of a long period of unhappiness and pretense. In Sylvia, he found a partner who shared his love for adventure, for travel, for living life on a grand and glamorous scale. She was not a homebody like Mary. She was a citizen of the world, just as he was. Their courtship was a globe-trotting extravaganza, conducted largely on the decks of his magnificent yacht, the Vagabondia. They sailed through the Panama Canal. They explored the Far East. They holidayed in the chicest resorts of the French Riviera. They were trying to outrun the scandal, but everywhere they went, they were hounded by reporters and photographers, their every move documented for a fascinated public. Fairbanks showered Sylvia with lavish gifts, priceless jewels, haute couture gowns, and, it was rumored, a promise to make her the new queen of Hollywood. There's a telling story from this period. While docked in a European port, a brash American journalist managed to get close to the couple and shouted a question at Sylvia. "Lady Ashley, how does it feel to have broken up the world's greatest love story?" Fairbanks bristled, ready to confront the man, but Sylvia, with a cool, unshakable poise, simply smiled serenely and replied, "My dear man, stories have beginnings and endings. We are simply starting a new chapter." It was a masterful performance, a demonstration of the steely nerve that lay beneath her delicate exterior. She refused to be cast as the villain in someone else's story. She was determined to be the heroine of her own. Finally, in January of 1936, Mary Pickford was granted a divorce. The path was clear. 2 months later in Paris, Douglas Fairbanks and Lady Sylvia Ashley were married in a quiet civil ceremony. The scandal had reached its climax. The king had abdicated his throne beside America's sweetheart and had chosen a new consort. Sylvia had weathered the storm. She was now Mrs. Douglas Fairbanks, the wife of one of the most famous men in the world. They returned to California not in disgrace but in triumph, ready to establish a new court, a new kingdom by the sea. Upon their return to Hollywood, Sylvia and Douglas did not move into the fabled Pick Fair, that magnificent estate, so laden with memories and symbolism, remained Mary Pickford's domain, a silent, powerful reminder of the past. Instead, the new couple established their own kingdom at Fairbanks's beachfront property in Santa Monica. It was no mere cottage. It was a sprawling, elegant villa right on the sand, a place of stunning beauty that quickly became one of the epicenters of Hollywood social life. Sylvia slipped into the role of Hollywood hostess as if she were born to it. She had in a way been training for this her entire life. Her parties were legendary. They were a sophisticated blend of European elegance and Hollywood glamour. On any given night, one might find Charlie Chaplin engaged in a witty debate with a visiting British duke, while David Niven traded jokes with the director Ernst Lubitsch, and a host of international celebrities and intellectuals mingled on the vast verandas overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Sylvia was in her element. She had an almost magical ability to put people at ease, to orchestrate an evening with a light, invisible touch. David Niven, a close friend of the couple, wrote about her in his memoir, The Moon's a Balloon. He described her as a woman of enormous charm and a will of iron. He recounted how she transformed the beach house into the most sought-after and beautifully run establishment in the film colony, noting her impeccable taste and her talent for creating an atmosphere of relaxed, sparkling fun. For a time, it seemed like the perfect life. Sylvia had her king, and she had her kingdom by the sea. They were a dazzling couple, traveling the world, entertaining in style, and living a life of almost unimaginable luxury. But the shadow of the past was long, and the foundations of this new kingdom were not as solid as they appeared. The ghost of Pickfair, and of the perfect love it represented, still haunted them. Fairbanks was a man at war with time. He was deeply insecure about his age and his waning status in a Hollywood that was rapidly moving on from the silent era. His famous athleticism was now a source of anxiety, as he pushed his 50-something body to its limits to prove he was still the hero he had once been. This inner turmoil often manifested as a deep, brooding melancholy, a dark mood that would descend upon him without warning. Sylvia, a woman who thrived on energy and optimism, found these moods baffling and deeply frustrating. She tried everything to pull him out of his funks, throwing lavish parties, planning exciting trips, and surrounding him with witty and amusing people. But she was often fighting a losing battle. She was competing with his nostalgia for a golden past, a past in which he was the undisputed youthful king, and Mary Pickford was his queen. A particularly revealing and little-told story from this time comes from the diaries of a Hollywood screenwriter who was a frequent guest at their home. He describes an evening where Sylvia had planned a surprise birthday party for Douglas. She had filled the house with hundreds of gardenias, his favorite flower, hired a famous jazz trio, and invited all his closest friends. When Fairbanks arrived, however, he was in one of his dark moods. He barely spoke to the guests, retreating to a corner of the garden to stare out at the ocean. The screenwriter observed Sylvia's reaction. Her smile never faltered, he wrote. She moved through the room like a perfect hostess, a vision in white silk. But I saw her eyes, and in them there was a look of such profound exhaustion and helpless sorrow. It was the look of a woman who realizes that all the love and all the money in the world cannot fix a man who is broken inside. This was the private reality behind the public fairy tale. Sylvia, the great conqueror of society, had found herself in a battle she could not win. She had captured the king, but she could not vanquish the ghost that haunted his kingdom. The magnificent, glittering lake of Hollywood royalty, into which she had so triumphantly plunged, was proving to have a powerful, sorrowful undercurrent that threatened to pull her down. Their spectacular marriage, born of scandal and passion, was heading towards a final tragic act that neither of them could have ever foreseen. When we last saw Lady Sylvia Ashley, she had seemingly achieved it all. She had weathered the storm of a global scandal to marry the king of Hollywood, Douglas Fairbanks. She was the mistress of a magnificent beachfront kingdom, a celebrated hostess at the very center of the movie world solar system. But beneath the sun-drenched glamour of Santa Monica, A quiet chill had begun to set in. Her husband, the great swashbuckler, was fighting a losing battle against time, his famous optimism increasingly clouded by a deep and inconsolable melancholy. Sylvia, the vibrant life of every party, found herself in the loneliest of positions, trying to cheer up a man who was mourning his own fading legend. The perfect, glittering lake she had chosen for herself was turning out to be deeper, darker, and colder than she had ever imagined. The year 1939 was a time of endings. For the world, it marked the end of a fragile peace, as the jackboots of the Third Reich began their march across Europe, plunging the continent into the darkness of the Second World War. For Sylvia, it would bring an end of a much more personal and devastating kind. In a desperate attempt to outrun his demons and recapture the magic of their early courtship, Fairbanks planned one last grand tour of Europe for them. It was a trip freighted with a frantic, almost manic energy. They attended film festivals, hobnobbed with exiled royalty, and partied in the grand capitals of a continent that was holding its breath on the eve of destruction. Friends who saw them during this trip noted a change in Fairbanks. He was still the charming host, the man with the dazzling smile, but there was a new fragility about him. He tired easily, and his famous physique seemed to have lost some of its vitality. He was a man who had built his entire identity on boundless physical energy, and the quiet betrayal of his own body was a terror he refused to acknowledge. Sylvia, ever the dutiful and glamorous consort, played her part, her jewels sparkling, her laughter echoing through the grand hotel suites. But she, too, was aware of the encroaching shadows. They returned to their home in Santa Monica in the late autumn. The trip had exhausted Fairbanks more than he let on. He threw himself back into his punishing fitness routines, trying to will himself back to strength. On the night of December 11th, 1939, they hosted a small dinner party. Douglas was in high spirits, telling stories and charming his guests as he always had. After the guests left, he complained of feeling unwell and retired to bed. In the early hours of the next morning, at the age of just 56, Douglas Fairbanks, the immortal hero, the man who had leaped from balconies and crossed swords with 1,000 villains, died peacefully in his sleep from a massive heart attack. The news of his death was a global shockwave. It was the end of an era. The world mourned the loss of a man who had been a symbol of joy and adventure for an entire generation. For Sylvia, the shock was absolute. One moment she was the wife of a living legend. The next, she was his widow. At just 35 years old, she was alone again, her glittering Hollywood kingdom suddenly silent and empty. The aftermath was a blur of funeral arrangements, legal meetings, and the intense, suffocating glare of public scrutiny. The world was watching her, this controversial Englishwoman who had been by the king's side at the end. And then came the reading of the will, another public spectacle that would shape the next chapter of her life. Fairbanks, a famously generous man, had not forgotten her. He left Sylvia a substantial inheritance, their Santa Monica beach house, and a trust fund worth approximately $1 million. In 1939, this was an immense fortune, guaranteeing her financial independence for the rest of her life. But it was what he didn't leave her that spoke volumes. The vast bulk of his estate, his controlling shares in the powerful United Artists studio, his production company, and his most personal assets, went to his only son, Douglas Fairbanks Jr., himself a major movie star. The message, whether intended or not, was clear. Sylvia had been his wife, but the Fairbanks dynasty, the true legacy, belonged to his son. This created a new and somewhat tense dynamic. While she and Douglas Jr. were always publicly cordial, there was an undeniable distance. She was the woman who had replaced his mother, and while he was too much of a gentleman to ever be unkind, she was never truly accepted as part of the family's inner sanctum. Now a wealthy and famous widow, Sylvia was faced with a choice. She could retreat from the spotlight, live a quiet life of luxury, but that was never her style. The world, however, had changed irrevocably. The frivolous, party-filled Hollywood she had known was transforming. With America's eventual entry into the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the city became a nerve center for the war effort. Stars traded their tuxedos for uniforms, and glamorous parties were replaced by sober war bond drives. Sylvia adapted as she always did. She threw herself into war-related causes, volunteering for the Red Cross and hosting events to raise money for British war relief. Her home became a welcome haven for British actors and servicemen passing through Los Angeles, a small corner of England on the California coast. She was doing her part, but the war years were a strangely quiet and transitional period for her. The great romantic adventures seemed to be over, replaced by the grim reality of a world in conflict. During this time, it seemed she might find happiness in a more conventional and perhaps more suitable union. She became engaged to a man who was, in many ways, her perfect match, Major Edward Molyneux. Bunny Molyneux was a fascinating figure, a highly successful and celebrated British couturier, whose elegant, understated designs were the epitome of chic. He was also a decorated war hero, having lost an eye in the First World War. He was witty, sophisticated, immensely creative, and moved in the same international high society circles as Sylvia. Their engagement was seen as a wonderful and fitting pairing. This relationship, so often a mere footnote in her story, was actually a significant and serious romance. A marriage to Molyneux would have cemented her status as a great tastemaker and style icon. But the union never happened. The engagement was quietly broken off. The reasons remained shrouded in a bit of mystery. Perhaps the uncertainties of the war made long-term plans impossible. Perhaps Molyneux, a man known for his intense dedication to his work, was not willing to relocate to California, or perhaps Sylvia, having been the consort to a king, was simply not ready to be the wife of a designer, however brilliant. Whatever the reason, it was another closed chapter, another path not taken. As the war drew to a close, Sylvia was still on her own, a glamorous and somewhat lonely figure, surveying the changed landscape of the post-war world, and perhaps wondering if her days as a great romantic heroine were truly over. She need not have worried. The greatest, most tragic, and most famous leading man in the world was about to walk into her life. If Douglas Fairbanks was the king of Hollywood in the silent era, Clark Gable was the undisputed emperor of the sound era. He was quite simply the biggest movie star in the world. His role as Rhett Butler in 1939's Gone with the Wind had cemented his status as a cultural icon. He was the epitome of rugged masculine charm, a man's man and a woman's fantasy. His on-screen persona was one of confident, almost arrogant power. But the man behind the image in the years following the war was a shadow of his former self. He was a king in mourning, a man haunted by a grief so profound it had nearly destroyed him. In 1939, the same year Sylvia lost Fairbanks, Gable had married the love of his life, the brilliant and beautiful actress Carole Lombard. Their marriage was a Hollywood anomaly. It was real. They were passionately in love, two equals who shared a sharp wit, a down-to-earth sensibility, and a disdain for Hollywood pretense. They bought a 20-acre ranch in Encino in the San Fernando Valley, which they filled with horses, chickens, and a menagerie of beloved pets. It was their sanctuary, a place where he could be Pa and she could be Ma, away from the pressures of fame. He was, by all accounts, completely and utterly devoted to her. And then, in a heartbeat, she was gone. In January 1942, Lombard was on a war bond tour, selling millions of dollars worth of bonds to support the troops. On her way home, the plane carrying her and 21 others, including her mother, went down in the mountains of Nevada. There were no survivors. The loss shattered Clark Gable. He was consumed by a guilt that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had wanted her to take the train home, which was slower but safer. She, impatient to get back to him, had insisted on flying. For weeks he was inconsolable, wandering his empty ranch like a ghost. Then, in a move that shocked Hollywood, the 41-year-old superstar enlisted in the Army Air Corps as a private. He went through the officer training and eventually served as an aerial gunner on B-17 bombers, flying 5 combat missions over Germany. Many of his friends believed it was a suicide mission, a desperate attempt to either die in action or somehow atone for the loss of his wife. He survived the war and returned to Hollywood, but he was a changed man. The famous grin was gone, replaced by a permanent sadness in his eyes. He resumed his career, but his heart wasn't in it. He embarked on a series of well-publicized but meaningless affairs with some of the most beautiful actresses in Hollywood, including Lana Turner and Paulette Goddard. But he kept everyone at a distance, refusing to let anyone get close. The ranch, Carol's Ranch, remained a shrine to her memory. He was the most famous, most desired, and most emotionally unavailable man in the world. This was the man Sylvia Ashley met in the late 1940s. Their meeting was a slow burn. They moved in the same circles, and he was undoubtedly aware of the glamorous English lady. For her part, she saw a challenge. Here was the ultimate prize, the king of Hollywood, wounded and withdrawn, a man who had seemingly sworn off love forever. Sylvia, with her charm, her vivacity, and her own experience with grief, was uniquely equipped for the challenge. She was not a giggling starlet, easily intimidated by his fame. She was his equal in social standing, a woman of the world who could talk to him about politics, art, and travel. Friends began to notice a change in Gable. When he was with Sylvia, he seemed lighter. She made him laugh. She didn't press him to talk about the past. She simply offered him a present filled with sparkling conversation, elegant dinners, and glamorous fun. She was slowly, skillfully coaxing the lion out of his cave. Their courtship became the talk of the town. The eternally grieving widower was finally seen smiling again. He began taking her to his favorite hunting lodges, and she, in turn, invited him to her sophisticated parties. They were an odd couple, the rugged outdoorsy American icon and the supremely elegant English aristocrat. But somehow it worked. Then, in December 1949, they did what everyone in Hollywood thought was impossible. They eloped. They drove to Santa Barbara and were married in a simple ceremony with only his ranch foreman and the foreman's wife as witnesses. The news was a bombshell. Sylvia Hawkes, the girl from Paddington, had done it again. She had married not one, but 2 successive kings of Hollywood. It was an unprecedented social coup, a testament to her incredible, almost supernatural allure. She was now Mrs. Clark Gable, the new mistress of the fabled Encino Ranch. Sylvia's new life as Mrs. Gable was a world away from the life she had led with Douglas Fairbanks. The Santa Monica Beach House had been a palace of cosmopolitan glamour, a place for tuxedos, champagne, and witty repartee. The Encino Ranch was a ranch. It was a working farm, a place of dusty roads, horse manure, and early mornings. Clark Gable was not a man who enjoyed high society. His idea of a perfect evening was cleaning his hunting rifles, playing poker with his friends, and having a simple steak for dinner. Sylvia, to her credit, threw herself into her new role with gusto. She was determined to be the perfect rancher's wife, but her version of ranch life was, to put it mildly, a little different from Gable's. She immediately began a massive redecoration of the house, which had been left largely untouched since Carol Lombard's death. She painted over Lombard's beloved white paneling with a fashionable gray, imported antique furniture from Europe, and replaced the simple rustic curtains with heavy, luxurious drapes. To the old guard of Hollywood, who revered the memory of Carol Lombard, this was sacrilege. It was seen as an attempt to erase the ghost of her predecessor. Her attempts to embrace Gable's hobbies were often a source of gentle, and sometimes not so gentle, amusement. The story of her trying to cook him fried chicken became a piece of Hollywood lore. Accustomed to a life with personal chefs, she found the simple act of frying a chicken to be a mysterious and messy ordeal. Gable, watching her flustered attempts, eventually had to step in. Another famous story involved a hunting trip. Gable loved his annual duck hunting trips with his male friends. Rough, all-male affairs. Sylvia insisted on coming along. She arrived at the rustic hunting lodge, not in practical outdoor gear, but in a beautifully tailored tweed suit, complete with a matching hat and gloves, followed by a porter carrying her designer luggage. Gable's friends were speechless. She was a good sport, but she was as out of place as a Fabergé egg in a tackle box. The fundamental clash was one of lifestyle. She longed for the glamour she had left behind. She tried to bring her world to the ranch, hosting elegant dinner parties that Gable often found stuffy and boring. He would dutifully put on a suit, but would often disappear early to go check on his horses. She, in turn, found his world of hunting, fishing, and endless talk of tractors to be utterly bewildering. Their affection for each other was genuine. He was amused by her elegance, and she was drawn to his solid, earthy presence. But the ghost that haunted this marriage was, if anything, even more powerful than the one that had haunted her marriage to Fairbanks. Carol Lombard wasn't just a beloved ex-wife. She was a martyred saint. Her presence was everywhere at the ranch, in the trees she had planted, in the memories of Gable's old friends, and most powerfully in Gable's own heart. He had loved Lombard with an all-consuming passion, and while he cared for Sylvia deeply, it was a different, quieter, more compromised kind of love. Sylvia was once again in the impossible position of competing with a memory, and a perfect, tragic memory at that. She was the sophisticated, worldly woman who had replaced the down-to-earth, all-American girl. The public, and even many of their friends, never fully accepted her in the role. The pressure began to mount. The differences in their personalities, once charming quirks, became sources of friction. The King of Hollywood and his English lady, the couple that had shocked the world, were beginning to discover that love, unfortunately, was not always enough to bridge the gap between two completely different worlds. The second Great Lake she had chosen was proving to be just as turbulent as the first. When we last left Sylvia, she was once again Queen of Hollywood, the wife of the great Clark Gable. She had achieved the impossible for a second time, marrying the reigning monarch of the silver screen. But her new kingdom, a rustic ranch in the San Fernando Valley, felt more like a gilded cage than a palace. The ghost of her predecessor, the beloved Carol Lombard, lingered in every room, and the lifestyle of her earthy outdoorsman husband was a world away from the sophisticated glamour she craved. The second great fairy tale of her life was already beginning to fray at the edges, its brilliant colors fading into the quiet, dusty reality of a life that simply didn't fit. The marriage unraveled not with a dramatic explosion, but with the slow, grinding friction of two fundamentally incompatible souls. Clark Gable, for all his genuine affection for Sylvia, was a man set in his ways. He had found his paradise with Carole Lombard, and that paradise was the ranch. It was his refuge from the phoniness of Hollywood, a place of authenticity and peace. He had hoped Sylvia would seamlessly slip into the role of Ma, the partner who would share in his simple pleasures. But Sylvia was not, and could never be, Carole Lombard. She was Lady Ashley. She was a woman who thrived on the energy of people, on sparkling conversation, on the exquisite art of living beautifully. Her attempts to bring her world to his often backfired. One well-documented story tells of her decision to install a swimming pool at the ranch. To Gable, this was an unnecessary Hollywood-style affectation. The ranch was for raising chickens and riding horses, not for poolside cocktails. But Sylvia, accustomed to getting her way, went ahead. The construction was a constant source of tension. Gable saw it as a frivolous expense and an intrusion into his sanctuary. Sylvia saw it as a basic necessity for any self-respecting California home, a place to entertain, a symbol of the life she felt they ought to be living. The pool was finally completed, a beautiful turquoise jewel set in the rustic landscape, but it became a symbol of the unbridgeable gulf between them. She grew increasingly lonely. Gable's long hunting and fishing trips, which he often took with his male friends, left her isolated on the sprawling ranch for weeks at a time. The Hollywood crowd she had once held in the palm of her hand rarely made the trek out to the sticks of Encino. She was a brilliant hostess with no one to host. Her wit, her charm, her impeccable taste, the very qualities that had captivated kings, were withering on the vine. A former member of her staff from this period later recounted she would spend days planning a dinner party menu, selecting the linens, arranging the flowers to perfection for just the two of them. It was heartbreaking, in a way. She was putting on a command performance for an audience of one, and half the time, that audience would rather have been in the barn. This poignant image speaks volumes about her quiet desperation, her attempt to maintain her own identity and standards in a world where they simply didn't belong. The end came in 1951. After a particularly tense period, Sylvia moved out of the ranch and into a suite at the Beverly Hills Hotel. The separation was official. The divorce, finalized in 1952, was another media sensation. The official reason was the classic Hollywood excuse, irreconcilable differences. But the gossip columns were filled with stories of their clashing lifestyles. Clark Gable, the rugged American hero, had been unable to be tamed by the sophisticated English lady. Or, depending on which columnist you read, the cold social climbing Sylvia had failed to appreciate the simple, honest life of a great man. The public, who had never truly warmed to her as a replacement for Carole Lombard, largely sided with Gable. The financial settlement was generous, but it was not the fortune she had inherited from Fairbanks. It was a clean break. At 48 years old, Sylvia was once again on her own. She was a two-time divorcee from the two biggest stars in Hollywood history. It was a distinction no other woman on earth could claim, but it was also a heavy crown to wear. What do you do after you've been queen twice? Where do you go from the absolute pinnacle of fame? The years immediately following her divorce from Gable were a period of restless wandering for Sylvia. She was a woman adrift, fabulously wealthy and utterly free, but seemingly without an anchor. She embarked on a whirlwind of travel, flitting between the great capitals of the world. She kept her house in California, but also had apartments in New York and Paris. She was a permanent fixture on the international best-dressed list, her taste as flawless as ever. She was a vital part of a new post-war phenomenon, the jet set. This was a nomadic tribe of the ultra-wealthy and the ultra-glamorous, a mix of old-world aristocrats, Greek shipping magnates, Hollywood stars, and South American playboys who moved with the seasons from one playground to the next, from the beaches of the Riviera in the summer to the ski resorts of the Alps in the winter. Sylvia was in her element. This was the life of excitement and constant stimulation she had always craved, but it was also a life that could be profoundly lonely. She was no longer defined by a famous husband. She was simply Lady Sylvia Ashley, a glamorous divorcee. She had a string of handsome escorts and rumored affairs, but nothing seemed to stick. There was a sense that she was searching for something, a new role, a new purpose, a new identity that could measure up to the ones she had left behind. She was at a dangerous age for a woman whose beauty had been her primary currency. In the harsh glare of the 1950s, a woman approaching 50 was considered to be past her prime. But Sylvia seemed to defy time. Her elegance, if anything, deepened. Her wit remained as sharp as ever. She was a formidable presence, a woman who had seen it all and survived. But friends from this period noted a new, hard-won wisdom about her and a touch of weary cynicism. In a rare, candid moment with a journalist who had become a trusted acquaintance, she was asked if she ever regretted her famous marriages. Her reported reply was both witty and deeply revealing. "Regret, darling? Never," she said, taking a long drag from her cigarette holder. "They were wonderful adventures. It's just, I discovered that marrying a monument is rather like living in a museum. Beautiful to look at, but awfully cold at night, and you're not allowed to move the furniture." This single quote offers a stunning insight into her journey. It was an acknowledgement of the glamour, but also a profound commentary on the loneliness of being the consort to men who were more public property than private partners. She was searching for a different kind of partnership now. She no longer needed to conquer Hollywood. She no longer needed to prove anything. She was looking for an equal, a man who belonged to her world, a man who understood the complex codes of international society, a man for whom a life of travel and elegance was not a strange affectation but a birthright. She was, in essence, looking for a prince. And in the gilded playground of the international jet set, she was about to find one. His name was Prince Dmitri Georgadi. And unlike the self-made royalty of Hollywood, he was the real thing. He was a member of the House of Georgadi, an ancient noble family from the nation of Georgia. His family had been princes and military leaders for centuries, but their world, like that of so many other European aristocrats, had been swept away by the Russian Revolution and the rise of the Soviet Union. The Georgadis, like the Romanovs, had lost their lands, their fortunes, and their country. They were now émigré royalty, scattered across Europe and America, clinging to their titles and their memories of a lost world. But Dmitri was no tragic, penniless exile. He was a survivor, just like Sylvia. He had adapted to the modern world with skill and charm. In his youth, he had been a successful racing driver, competing in some of Europe's most prestigious events. He had served with distinction in the Italian army during the First World War. After his racing career, he had used his impeccable connections and aristocratic grace to become a highly successful executive at the Hilton hotel chain, managing some of their most glamorous properties. He was a man of immense old-world charm, handsome, sophisticated, and utterly at home in the rarefied world of the international elite. He had been married before to the wealthy American heiress Audrey Emery, who had previously been married to the Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich of Russia, one of the men who had assassinated Rasputin. Dmitri Georgadi, therefore, was no stranger to wealthy, powerful, and complicated women. He moved through the world with a quiet confidence and a sense of effortless authority that came from a lineage 1,000 years old. He and Sylvia met in the early 1950s, moving in the same social circles in Paris, Rome, and New York. The attraction was immediate and profound. Here, finally, was a man who was her equal. He was not a wounded genius who needed saving. He was not a simple country boy bewildered by her sophistication. He was a man of the world, a prince who understood her need for a life of elegance and travel, because it was his life too. Their courtship was a mature, sophisticated affair, conducted not under the harsh glare of the Hollywood press, but in the more discreet and appreciative society of the international set. For Sylvia, this was the final perfect reinvention. To marry Dmitri was not just to gain another wealthy husband. It was to gain a title that was real, ancient, and indisputable. It was the ultimate validation. The little girl from the stables of Paddington, who had clawed her way up to become Lady Ashley, who had been crowned Queen of Hollywood twice over, was now to become a genuine princess. In February 1954, in a lavish ceremony in Palm Beach, Florida, Sylvia married her prince. She was now Princess Sylvia Georgadi. It was the triumphant final act of her incredible social ascent. The Swan had found her final and perhaps most fitting lake, the deep, ancient, and distinguished waters of European royalty. Their life together was, by all accounts, a happy and harmonious one. It was a partnership of equals, of two seasoned survivors who had seen the world and understood its complexities. They divided their time between their elegant apartment in New York and a villa in Europe. They traveled constantly, always in style, always at the center of a glittering circle of friends. This was not the turbulent, dramatic love affair of her youth. It was a mature companionship, built on a foundation of shared tastes, mutual respect, and a deep understanding of what it took to navigate their extraordinary world. Sylvia, now in her 50s and 60s, settled into her role as a princess with the same effortless grace she had brought to all her other roles. She was still a celebrated hostess, still a fashion icon, but there was a new sense of calm about her, a sense of having finally arrived at a safe harbor after a lifetime of sailing through stormy seas. But the ghosts of her past were never entirely banished. In November of 1960, the world was shocked by the news that Clark Gable had died of a heart attack, much like Douglas Fairbanks before him. He had remarried a fifth time to a former sweetheart named Kay Williams, who had given him the one thing Sylvia never had, a son. The ultimate poignant postscript to their story came when Gable was buried. By his own request, he was laid to rest in the great mausoleum at Forest Lawn Memorial Park, in the same crypt as the great love of his life, Carole Lombard. It was a final public declaration that, for all the wives who had come after, his heart had only ever belonged to one woman. One can only imagine how Sylvia received this news, a public and permanent reminder that she had been but an interlude in the great love story of his life. But Sylvia was a survivor. She had built a new life for herself, a life that was finally her own, shared with a man who was her partner, not her monument. As Princess Georgadi, she had found a measure of peace. She had navigated the treacherous waters of class, fame, and scandal, and had emerged improbably as royalty. The Swan, it seemed, had finally come home. When we last saw Sylvia, she had made her final, and perhaps most astonishing, transformation. The stable-keeper's daughter, the chorus girl, the lady of the manor, the twice-crowned Queen of Hollywood, had become Her Serene Highness, Princess Sylvia Georgadi. She had married a man with an ancient, indisputable title, a partner who was her equal in sophistication and worldly experience. In the wake of Clark Gable's death and his poignant, final reunion with Carole Lombard in the afterlife, Sylvia had firmly closed the door on her tumultuous Hollywood past. The Swan, it seemed, after testing the waters of many spectacular and stormy lakes, had finally found a calm, deep, and dignified harbor that felt like home. Her life with Prince Dmitri was the embodiment of the golden age of the jet set. The 1960s was a decade of unprecedented wealth, ease of travel, and a certain kind of hedonistic international glamour. And the Georgades were at its very heart. Their lives were a perpetual elegant migration, following the sun and the social seasons. Winters were spent in the exclusive Swiss ski resort of Gstaad, where they mingled with the Aga Khan, Elizabeth Taylor, and Richard Burton. Spring was for the grand balls and art openings of Paris. Summers were often spent cruising the Mediterranean on the yachts of Greek shipping tycoons like Aristotle Onassis, island hopping from one exclusive party to the next. Autumn would find them in New York for the opening of the social season. This was a world even more exclusive than the Hollywood she had known. It was a universe of inherited titles, unimaginable fortunes, and a discreet insider's code of conduct. And Sylvia, the ultimate outsider, navigated it with the consummate skill of a native. She had, in fact, been preparing for this role her entire life. Her wit, her charm, and her talent for creating an atmosphere of sparkling intimacy made their homes in New York and Europe essential stops on the international social circuit. Her marriage to Dmitri was, by all accounts, her most peaceful and contented union. It was a partnership built on a foundation of mutual understanding. There were no ghosts to compete with, no clashing lifestyles to reconcile. Dmitri, the émigré prince, understood the art of survival and reinvention just as she did. He admired her spirit and her American-style vivacity, while she, in turn, revered his old-world grace and the legitimacy his title conferred. He was the one man who was not a monument, not a public icon, whose heart was already owned by millions. He was hers. In this final chapter, she seemed to shed the restless ambition that had driven her for so long. She had nothing left to prove. She had reached the absolute summit. Friends who knew her in these later years described a woman who was more relaxed, more content in her own skin than she had ever been. The famous wit was still there, but it was softer now, less of a weapon and more of a gift. The hard, determined edge that had propelled her ascent had been smoothed away, replaced by the serene confidence of a woman who had won the game. She rarely, if ever, spoke of her famous ex-husbands. It was an unwritten rule among her friends that one did not bring up Fairbanks or Gable. It was not a sign of bitterness, but rather a reflection of her profound talent for living in the present. Those lives, those dramas, belonged to other women she had once been: Lady Ashley, Mrs. Fairbanks, Mrs. Gable. She was now Princess Georgadi, and that was the only role that mattered. She had so completely inhabited her final reinvention that her past seemed like a story she had once read about someone else, a dazzling and dramatic film she had once seen. There is a wonderful and telling anecdote from this period. At a dinner party in the late 1960s, a young, rather tactless American guest, starstruck to be in her presence, gushed, "Your Highness, it must have been incredible to be married to Rhett Butler." The table fell silent. It was a shocking breach of protocol. Sylvia paused, took a delicate sip of her wine, and then fixed the young man with a look that was not unkind, but was utterly regal. "My dear boy," she said, her voice a soft musical purr, "I was never married to Mr. Butler. I was, for a time, married to a very charming man who enjoyed farming. My husband," she said, turning to smile at Dmitri, "is a prince." In that single masterful exchange, she gently but firmly relegated the king of Hollywood to a mere character, a footnote in a life that was now defined by something she considered far more real and far more enduring. But even for a woman who seemed to defy time, the final inevitable act of life must begin. In the early 1970s, Sylvia's formidable health began to decline. She was diagnosed with cancer, a battle she fought with the same private courage and lack of self-pity that had defined her entire life. The endless travels ceased. The grand parties became fewer and farther between. She and Dmitri began to spend more and more time at their home in California, the state that had been the stage for her greatest triumphs and dramas. Her world, which had once spanned continents, now began to shrink to the quiet confines of her elegant house. For a woman who had lived so publicly, who had thrived on the energy of a crowd, this period of enforced stillness must have been a profound and difficult adjustment. But those who were with her during these final years spoke of a woman who faced her mortality with a remarkable sense of peace. She had lived a dozen lives in one, had experienced more glamour, passion, and adventure than most could ever dream of. There were no regrets. On the 29th of June, 1977, at her home in Los Angeles, with her prince by her side, Sylvia Georgadi, formerly Mrs. Clark Gable, formerly Mrs. Douglas Fairbanks, formerly Lady Ashley, and born Edith Sylvia Hawkes, died at the age of 73. Her death marked the quiet end of a life lived at a continuous roaring crescendo. Her husband, Prince Dmitri, the man who had given her a final chapter of peace and happiness, outlived her by 8 years, passing away in 1985. She was buried, not alongside any of her famous husbands, but on her own, a singular and independent figure, even in death, at the Hollywood Forever Cemetery, a stone's throw from the studios where her legend had been forged. So, as the curtain falls, what is the lasting legacy of Lady Sylvia Ashley? Culturally, she was a pioneer, the original professional wife who turned marriage itself into a form of high art and a career. She wrote the playbook on how a woman could use the institution not as an endpoint, but as a series of stepping stones to power and independence. The controversy that swirled around her, was she a gold digger or a romantic, ultimately misses the point. She was a brilliant pragmatist who played the game of life better and on a grander scale than almost anyone else. Her personal legacy is a more poignant story about the search for a perfect reflection. Each husband, each lake, offered something she needed: a title from Lord Ashley, a throne from Douglas Fairbanks, the ultimate prize from Clark Gable, and finally, peace and legitimacy from Prince Dmitri. Her journey and her famous admission that marrying a monument was like living in a museum is a timeless insight into the loneliness of fame. It reminds us that to be loved by millions is not the same as being truly seen by one. In the end, the story of Lady Sylvia Ashley is a staggering testament to the power of a single, indomitable will. She was born into a world that told her exactly where she belonged, and she politely, elegantly, and absolutely refused to listen. She authored her own life, creating a narrative so spectacular that it continues to fascinate. Her life was not a cautionary tale, but a breathtaking epic of success and survival. She was the swan who was never content with just one lake because her own spirit was too vast to be contained. Her life was her greatest performance, her most enduring masterpiece, a brilliant and unapologetic monument to a force of personality the world will surely never see again.